Ontario has decided to follow the lead of some European nations and try to narrow the gender wage gap. Today, Premier Kathleen Wynne announced legislation that aims to close pay gaps between men and women in the province. If passed, the Pay Transparency Bill would require the following. All published job postings have salaries listed. Employers would be barred from asking about past compensation, and bosses would be prohibited from punishing employees who discuss or disclose salaries. Large organizations would also need to track and report salary gaps based on gender and diversity. Where would this start? Ontario's Public Service will be the first to implement the rules. Then it will roll out to companies with more than 500 employees, followed by those with more than 250 workers. What about the numbers? Well, the province will spend up to $50 million over the next 3 years on this. Women have earned approximately 30% less than men over the last decade. The last time Ontario introduced pay equity laws was 30 years ago. Here's what Kathleen Wynne had to say today.
We are launching Then, Now, Next, Ontario's strategy for women's economic empowerment. It's a national first, so we can be proud of that here in Ontario, and it's a landmark that everyone in Ontario should celebrate. And I think we know that, yes, we're talking about women's empowerment. That's good for men, too.
To learn more about what pay transparency is and if it will narrow the wage gap between men and women, we're joined by Sarah Kaplan. She's a professor of strategic management at the Rotman School of Business. She's also professor of gender and the economy at the University of Toronto. So, Sarah Kaplan, what is your reaction to this announcement?
Well, thank you for having me join the program. I think it's good news, absolutely. Ontario was the first to pass its landmark pay equity legislation 30 years ago, as you noted, and these new measures are great complements to that, and part of the recommendations that came out of the gender wage gap study that was done within the government, including with the Pay Equity Commissioner. So I think these are all steps in the right direction.
And to be clear, when we talk about pay transparency, it's not as if everyone's going to have their own personal salary posted on a website somewhere. What's your understanding of how it will actually work?
Yes, well, we do have a version of pay transparency like that in the province of Ontario, which is the Sunshine Law for people who are in the public service earning over $100,000. And that is not a particularly effective way because you're benchmarking yourself against all these other individuals. The more effective pay transparency, which is the kind that's being proposed today for legislation, would be basically on a job class by job class basis. So you know the range of what people are paid within particular job classes. And I think that makes a lot more sense because you can understand where you fit within the range of the different kinds of jobs.
Now, but is this something that strictly should be focused on gender? I mean, do other people benefit from this sort of legislation, this sort of transparency?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, everyone benefits from a legislation that makes it clear what the salary bands are so that you know whether or not you're being paid within the band. And what pay transparency also does is still allow for an understanding that people have different performance levels. So, but it is enabling people to be able to negotiate if they do feel like they're being paid unfairly. I think that's a really important part of it. The other really important part of the legislation, though, is also not being allowed to ask people what their prior salaries were, because if we believe that women have been underpaid in other settings, then not benchmarking their new salary based on their old salary also helps kind of close the wage gap.
Right, and there's no punishment for people talking about salary. You know, I mean, pay is such a secretive thing, and part of it, I'm sure, is, you know, it's private, it's personal, people don't want it to be out there. I'm wondering how much is also that companies don't want people to discuss this sort of thing.
Well, absolutely. You know, pay is something that feels very private, and that's why I think releasing the information around a job class basis is much more helpful. But what we did see, for example, in the UK with their pay transparency laws, is that there was the recent case of the BBC, editor who discovered that she was being paid 50% of what her other male peers were being paid. And only could discover that because of pay transparency laws, and that led to a series of conversations, and including some of the male presenters taking lower salaries in order to make sure that people were paid fairly. So pay transparency does actually force organizations to be more equitable, and yes, some organizations are going to feel uncomfortable with that.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, is the European experience, what we've learned about how effective this type of legislation really is.
Well, I think the European experience does show that there's at least some marquee cases where the transparency has forced change. And we know in Iceland, for example, they're now actually going to penalize companies that don't prove that they have pay equality. So I think there are some positives, but I do want to call out the fact that the Ontario pay equity legislation that's been in place for 30 years is some of the most progressive legislation that's out there, that gets regularly benchmarked around the world. The part that we haven't had that this new legislation would help with is the transparency and the reporting component of it. But the actual elements in terms of understanding how to calculate and remedy differences in pay has always been there, but now we're going to have the transparency and the reporting requirement to go with it, which I think is only going to strengthen Ontario's lead as an exemplar around the world.
But on that point, I mean, the reporting requirement of it, what do you say to people who might comment that this is just more red tape, this is yet another report that businesses have to file to the government, that it might even hurt Ontario's competitiveness as a place that companies want to do business? What's your response?
Well, yes, I do think that there are a lot of reporting requirements on companies, and I hope that the government finds a way to streamline this so that it doesn't create an onerous kind of requirement. But the first layer of reporting only goes to companies that are 500 and larger after, of course, the public service. So these are companies that should have the capabilities to do this. The other thing that's really important is by doing the reporting, companies actually learn about themselves. It serves as a diagnostic through which they can actually come up with more equitable pay approaches, which actually they need to do anyway. It's required by law through human rights and through the pay equity legislation. So these reporting requirements should, in theory, actually help companies comply with the law and shouldn't be just an onerous reporting requirement, but actually a tool for diagnosis and change.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Sarah Kaplan is a professor of gender and the economy at the University of Toronto.